This is Where We Live from Connecticut Public Radio. I'm Frankie Graziano. The U.S. Bureau of Economic Analysis, they rank Connecticut as the second wealthiest state in the nation. But then, according to the Economic Policy Institute, Connecticut ranks third in the country for income inequality. Residents struggling to make ends meet, advocates where we live have called for systemic changes to housing, healthcare, and education, and the way those basic needs are funded. Now, for the first time under a new law, the state's budget's required to show how spending reduces socioeconomic and racial inequities in our state. That new budget law was passed last spring, calling for a, quote, explanation of how provisions further the governor's efforts to ensure equity in the state, helping to identify and remedy past and present patterns of discrimination. So how did Governor Lamont's $50-plus billion budget meet this mandate? And what's missing? This hour, we'll be tackling all the tricky topics, including housing, healthcare, and higher education. But first, let's talk big picture with our panel of experts. Right now joining me are Dan Haar, Associate Editor, Hearst Connecticut Media, and CT Insider. Good morning, Dan.
Great to be here.
I hope the oatmeal is just tasting fantastic this morning.
It is. Sound check food.
And now we also got my great friend. You're going to find her on Twitter at L.A. Hagan, Lisa Hagan, the federal policy reporter for the Connecticut Mirror and Connecticut Public.
Hey, great to be back.
Awesome to have you back as well. And if you're listening to this conversation right now, why don't you join us? 888-720-9677, 888-720-WNPR. Or you can find us on Facebook and Twitter at Where We Live. Dan, because of this new law we got that we just mentioned, there's certain requirements I think the state has to hit, right? I mean, how did Governor Lamont apply the law to the biennial budget proposal?
Well, basically what the governor did was he added an 8-page section of narrative to the introduction of his budget. And of course, I don't want to belittle it. It's not just an 8-page section. It is the 8-page section in which he says, here's what the governor and here's what the state here through this proposed budget will do and is doing to address inequities in the system. I want to be really careful to distinguish between the word inequity and inequality. Inequality is in the law, and the law does ask the state, require that the governor identify and remedy past and present patterns of discrimination or inequality against and disparities in outcomes for a protected class. So there's lots of stuff in there, and his main argument is, well, gee whiz, the main way we raise money is the income tax, and it's very, very progressive. That's number one.
How loosely can this law be interpreted? So, like, when he's showing his work like he has in 8 pages, is there a certain way he could do it? Is it you get the idea of how I'm talking about how he can loosely interpret it?
Well, as I was rereading it last night, and we heard it in the form of the budget speech that the governor gave, and the state of the state a month and a half ago. So, in other words, the points he's making. This is politics. We're helping people. That's what you talk about. Whether the law says you have to talk about helping people or you have to talk about helping people because you're a politician, you're going to talk about it. And this is what he's doing. And so I was thinking about how if the most conservative Republican or Democrat who favors the least redistribution of wealth were required to do this, he or she would say, we're building jobs. And by adding to the economy, by not spending money on social programs, the governor could say, he doesn't, but he could say, I'm helping inequity in this state because I'm helping build a strong economy by not spending state money. He could say that.
So in essence, it could be a little opportunity for a speech at the top of the budget or a way to inject politics, I guess, into the budget as well.
That's exactly right, except that it takes more to read 8 pages of a speech than to listen to 20 minutes, but it's essentially the same thing, and he goes over program by program.
Yeah. Hey, Lisa, I want to throw a couple of things at you here to give you an idea of the situation where we live. United Way of Connecticut, they project the basic survival budget for a family of 4 exceeds $90,000 per year. And spoiler alert, not everybody in Connecticut, not every household in Connecticut makes anywhere near $90,000 a year. And I guess prior to the pandemic, the organization projected 38% of Connecticut residents were living paycheck to paycheck or falling behind. Thanks to CT Mirror's longtime budget reporter, Keith Vanna, for that reporting. And on the equity front, too, by the way, some of these families that are making $90,000 a year, a majority of them are white. And black households, as I understand in the state that I've seen in reporting, are making about $58,000, and Latina and Hispanic households are making like $54,000. So, and some of this is using ALICE methodology, which factors the cost of childcare, healthcare, utilities, other factors. The federal poverty level does not. So, Lisa, with all that being said, take that ball of wax I just threw at you. What can you tell me about what politicians are saying about equity in Connecticut?
Yeah, it's hard because, you look at a state like Connecticut, and I think in some ways it's positioned better than many other states on this front. And at large, I mean, a lot of the national conversation on this just isn't, it's being talked about in Congress, but it's really not going many places. And you see that in terms of Connecticut looking at minimum wage just being higher and that just being stagnant at the national level. But obviously, in all the data you're citing, there's still vast income inequality in the state. And so I think a point that we'll all be kind of making in this hour is that a lot of these issues were addressed temporarily in an emergency way through pandemic measures, and a lot of that funding coming from the national level. And so a lot of that's just drying up and going away. And so it was a little bit of a Band-Aid. It kind of rectified in terms of, like, let's say the child tax credit at the federal level. It moved over and lifted millions of children out of poverty. But again, a lot of this stuff is going away or has gone away. And so I think, at least in terms of how Connecticut addresses this is going to come at the state level and not the national level, because Congress is just in a really politically difficult environment.
And let's go straight there. Let's go straight there. Before I get Dan in here, I want to ask you this very pointed question, Lisa. Do politicians care about equity right now? I mentioned this offhand to you earlier, but I was asking you about Ukraine offline because we once again care about Ukraine because we're getting closer to the 1-year anniversary. And then you have people showing up to the State of the Union and essentially treating it as if we're back in election season. It's only been 3 months since we had the midterm. So are we just in a perpetual state of politics and we're going to get whatever done on equity done whenever we do? What are your thoughts?
Yes, short answer, yes. I think a lot of people go into this obviously wanting to address income inequality and issues, revolving around equity. But I just don't see, at least the next 2 years, much of that getting done, because again, a lot of those issues were addressed through pandemic laws that are, again, phasing out or only going to be with us for so long. And then you saw, Democrats in Congress passing the Inflation Reduction Act, which was a catch-all for a lot of these things, whether it was trying to solve some equity issues, whether it's healthcare or taxes, and that'll be, drawn out through the next several years and potentially over at least into sort of this decade. But I just don't see a lot of that coming through. And so again, it's interesting watching everything happening at the state level in Connecticut, because I think that's where we're going to see potentially more movement.
Dan, get in here on this.
I don't agree. But, well, listen, I agree with some of what Lisa said, but I would like to be more optimistic than to say that just because the $6 trillion in pandemic money is winding down, that this economy has no mechanism for addressing equity. I disagree with that in the sense that if we start creating jobs at a clip of 500,000 a month, which the U.S. did hit once, and that's an amazing number. But even if we average 300,000 a month nationally, and if Connecticut grows jobs at a rate of 2%, right, which is what's been happening, if that continues because the economy is sparked, then that's an awfully good mechanism for changing equity. But we have to really go back a step here. And when I mentioned at the top, there's a difference between equity and inequality. Inequality is, of course, the measure of the difference between the rich and the poor. So Connecticut has a whole lot of very rich people, and that's why we're the most or the second most unequal state. But if Ray Dalio, who just retired and harvested a couple of $1 billion from his hedge fund, moves with his wife to to California or Florida or someplace else, do you feel better? No, of course you don't, because you're going to have to now pay taxes that he's paying and she's paying. So, but yet the state would be more equal. Equality shouldn't be the goal. Equity should be. Equity is fairness. What is a fair way for people to live when they work hard? And that's really what we have to address. And I do think the economy can do that without $6 trillion, although the programs that that money is paying for are real and do help people. So it's both sides of the coin.
Just for the uninitiated, the Dallios, Barbara and Ray Dalio, they had that foundation that collaborates with, for a while, they collaborated with the Department of Education, and that was a big story in and of itself. But they have their philanthropic efforts or whatever, and that's what kind of Dan was alluding to there. But no, I want to go back to I think the point though that Lisa's making, and I think it's a valid one, is that Connecticut's on its own. Like the pandemic relief that may be drying up, and can we really count on Congress to do anything right now that benefits anybody other than their own political standing? I think that's the point that's being made. Am I wrong, Lisa?
No, and I take Dan's point very well, and it's the pandemic relief, I mean, it's supposed to put in place certain structures that can exist beyond, the however many years it was going to put money into states and at the national level. So, but yeah, it's just, things are just really tricky in Congress right now. It was nearly impossible to pass a lot of these things that I just spoke about, and it's only going to get harder over the next 2 years. And so my point looking at Connecticut is that I think a lot of this is going to emanate from the state rather than the national level, though I'm sure Congress will continue to try.
Lisa, do you think the infrastructure bill going to help?
I think so. I guess in terms of inequality, maybe I look more to the Inflation Reduction Act about kind of smoothing some of that over and trying to solve more equity issues, especially when you look at something like healthcare.
Go right there and help us understand how Connecticut fits into the Inflation Reduction Act as well.
Yeah, I mean, in looking at healthcare specifically, again, my point always with Congress is going to be that things always have to get pared down and go through negotiations. So overall, in terms of the healthcare picture, we saw some Affordable Care Act subsidies get extended for several years. So that's going to have a short-term to medium-term impact. But on the whole, they couldn't get a lot done for just the average person being insured. And so a lot of that is going to be helpful for people who are Medicare. So it's seniors. And so that obviously very important, but it's just these things are, in smaller silos and are going to take several to 5 to 10 years to implement. So I think it addressed a lot of these issues that we're talking about. But beyond that, I don't know what else could come nationally. That's just to be seen.
It's funny that Lisa works in one of these areas in the nation that is the largest disparity in terms of economics, or in the distribution of wealth in the nation, down in D.C. And we're up here where Fairfield County is among the top 3 as well. And I remember when I was covering childcare, I did this big cut line for Connecticut Public last year on childcare and the importance on mental health and the development of children. And I was told that a lot of these folks that are in D.C., they've probably paid some au pair or something like that, or a family member or whatever, all the money to watch their kids. They didn't have to worry about these kind of things. They're really kind of closed off for these conversations that are really important that people have to try to figure out how to make ends meet. So, are we just in a situation, Dan and Lisa, where our politicians, our lawmakers, are just so disconnected from where the rest of us are? Is that why we have inequality?
No. Show me a successful region, and I'll show you inequality. Inequality is a fake measure of prosperity. Equity, in the sense that if you go to work 40 hours a week, 50, if you're a journalist, 100, if you go to work, and do you get a fair wage, and can you live a decent life? The fact that there are billionaires floating around making the world an unequal place, to me, is not the picture that we need to be looking at. And so government has a limited ability to control inequality. It has a strong role in controlling how to make people's lives better in a way that's fair. And so those are two different things. That's just one quick observation.
I brought up, Lisa, the fact that Fairfield County has this big disparity, and so does the D.C. area. I think it's Alexandria, Virginia, to be exact. But are there any other? Are we so different from everybody else? Where's Connecticut stand in your estimation from some of the other folks you're talking to down there?
Yeah, it's interesting you bring that up. No, DC has very similar issues where you have, I mean, DC is just weird in the sense that we are federal government and then also operate as a normal city, which people tend to forget about, and it's extreme income inequality there. And, you bring up Fairfield County, and I think about Jim Himes, and I have talked about this a bit, where his district is it is the richest and some of the poorest. And it's just, I think Connecticut fits right in with a lot of places, DC included, and around the country that are dealing with this. And I don't, I think we all, and myself maybe included, look at things or think that politicians are looking at things pretty cynically. And I just take to Dan's point that, there's some things that, government, and again, as I make the point again, that the state will have to kind of contend with over Congress. Yeah,
we're gonna go right to Dan back on this one. Okay, so we have baby bonds, right? Well, this is a great example, I think, and you could tell me if I'm wrong. But you have baby bonds, which is, we had Eric Russell on a program last week on Disrupted. Kalila Brown Dean hosts it, and he's saying, "Hey, we're looking forward to the launch of baby bonds." And then you have Jeff Beckham speaking essentially on behalf of the governor. Jeff Beckham runs OPM. He says it's off the table essentially. So why would baby bonds be off the table? Why wouldn't that be something that we would support? Something that can give people of color or people that are born into poverty a chance to invest or whatever in the future? Why would that be off the table?
First of all, baby bonds are not off the table. Baby bonds are not in the strategic planning of this governor. This governor is a significantly powerful governor, but he's not all powerful. And there are maybe 50 to 60 legislators who strongly prefer baby bonds, and they tend to vote similarly to each other often, meaning they have significant power. One of them is Senator Marilyn Moore from Bridgeport. I called her after Jeff Beckham addressed us and talked about baby bonds, and I said, "Are you sitting down? I'm going to play a tape for you." And I played a recording of what he said, and that's when she hit the roof and said, "Oh no, that's not over. This fight goes on." Baby bonds are important precisely because of what the three of us have been talking about. There is a difference in inequality and equity between asset-based, that is what you own, and income-based measures. Income is how much money you make. Assets is really what makes the rich rich. It's not income, right? Baby bonds is the one and only government program that addresses the differential in assets by having somebody at birth get a sum of money that grows when that person becomes a young adult. That's why it's so important to so many people. This governor doesn't like it, to answer your question, because he'd rather spend the money now on things to make people's lives better now. That's not wrong or right.
Jeff Beckham saying the governor does not support this program. It's $50 million in bonding for the program in FY 2025. He says we're not making any new proposals with regard to that program in this budget. So
let me clarify. He's saying we're never going to allocate that $50 million. The law says we have to authorize it. We are authorizing it. We're not going to spend it. That's what he's saying.
Where's Senator Marilyn Moore from?
Bridgeport.
Yeah, they gotta. Maybe they could distribute some of that wealth that they have in Fairfield to Bridgeport.
Oh, there you go. That's an idea.
The mirror. I just really want to go back here. I guess to the grand thing that we're trying to talk about, Dan. Here is a lot of people have been saying that there's this $3.3 billion rainy day fund, and then maybe 3.1 in surplus. We have about probably $6.5 billion, something like that, in surpluses. Do we really have a surplus if we have such an unfunded obligations in the future that may total something like $88 billion or something like that? Can you tackle equity with this money if you have all this happening in the future that's staring you down?
Yeah, that's what President Johnson called guns and butter. We can do both. This governor believes that you can cut taxes by $600 million. You can very slightly improve social spending, not nearly enough to satisfy the people in the legislature who want those programs beefed up, to Lisa's point, and that you can also pay down that pension. Remember, paying down the pension liability, we don't feel it right now, but it acts as a tax cut. For every $100 million you pay down, and he's paid down $5.8 billion. So for every 100 million, you get $8.5 million a year for 25 years knocked off of your liability. So it's a great investment, and that's what the governor's trying to do, both things.
And just back to Keith Faniff's reporting, he says that Connecticut's one of the most indebted states per capita in the nation, with more than $88 billion in bonded debt, unfunded
That's not Keith Faniff's reporting. That's fact. That's fact. That's what the treasurer and the controller have said. $88 billion is the most recent report in 2022.
I knew that'd get the oatmeal, the stew in your stomach a little bit.
You're like, let's keep that. That's a public figure. The $88 billion is a number that's billion.
Yeah.
Is a number that's out there. Sadly, what happens as we pay it down, it doesn't necessarily decline because market conditions and all kinds of other factors go into it. So we haven't seen the progress that we need to see.
We're talking about I just want to finish up here for this segment. We're talking about one proposal I've heard. It doesn't sound like it's going to go anywhere, but one proposal I've heard is to get this could contribute to equity in some way. To get the minimum wage up, which just recently was raised up to $15 an hour, to $25 an hour for certain workers. So I'm not sure where that's going to go. It doesn't sound like anybody that I talked to on both in really all the caucuses are, I guess, interested in getting this through. So Lisa, though, it sounds like in our talks with you before the show that Connecticut's actually doing a decent job on minimum wage compared to the rest of the nation.
Yes, and compared to nationally, I mean, it has been stagnant at $7.25 at a federal minimum wage for a very long time, and so there's been talk and efforts in Congress to get it up to 15, which really wouldn't, even if it were to pass, which it's stalled, it wouldn't change things for Connecticut too much. And so I think where things could be really interesting in a national and both state dialogue is on the sub minimum wages, is lifting minimum wage for tipped workers. It's those people, especially in the service industry, who get lower than a minimum wage, and it's supposed to be replaced and covered by the tips that you make. And so I think that is one interesting facet of all of this that I know at least it's happening in Connecticut and at least been talked about at the national level.
Yeah, the federal minimum wage is what you're alluding to there. I think I said $15. It is almost $15. That's the plan. It's to get it to $15 by I think this fiscal year. So right now it's like 14 or 14.25 or something like that. The federal minimum wage, is there any chance that goes up soon? Lisa, have you heard any talks about that?
Most likely not. It is something that was brought up in the last Congress, and that's when Democrats had all of Congress and in addition to the White House. And so that didn't really go anywhere. That was one of the issues that were important to Democrats and especially progressives. And I just don't see it going anywhere currently. But again, this is something where maybe Connecticut leads a little bit more compared to the nation or some other states.
Dan and Lisa, I'm going to have you guys stay with us. We're going to dig into the education conversation, maybe the higher ed conversation on equity after a quick break. Jonathan Wharton, political science professor at Southern Connecticut State University, is going to join us, and you can join us in the conversation, 888-720-9677. This is Where We Live from Connecticut Public Radio. I'm Frankie Graziano. 700 students and UConn allies, including this gentleman who has a "It's me, hi, I'm the problem, it's me" sign blaming the governor in the state of Connecticut about the budget, flooded the state capitol a week ago, making headlines protesting Governor Lamont's budget allotment for the university system that the group said was short $357 million. Lamont, he maintains the budget for UConn and higher ed was historic. Joining us now to discuss the standoff and the larger issue of education in the context of this conversation around equity, Jonathan Wharton, the preppy prof, professor of political science at Southern Connecticut State University and associate dean at the School of Graduate and Professional Studies. Good morning.
Good morning. How are you?
How are we doing in Brantford this morning?
Well, actually, I'm on campus today. So.
Oh, he's on campus.
Yeah. Yep.
Ready for a day of learning.
Indeed.
And also with us still, Lisa Hagan, our federal policy reporter for us and Connecticut Mirror, and Dan Haar, associate editor of CT Insider and Hearst Connecticut Media. And if you want to join us, I don't see any calls coming in, so if you want to call us right now, I'd probably get you on pretty quickly. You can join the conversation, 888-720-9677. Dan, I want to. You guys both wrote columns on this. You said the numbers tell two stories, and that clearly this fight over money is more than just about money. What does that mean?
Well, the fight over money is about the strategic direction of the state. And in UConn's case, I've covered budget disputes for 35 years or so, I guess. I don't know, maybe hundreds of them. And certainly one every year in every jurisdiction I've ever covered, plus then. And I've never seen a dispute where there is not agreement about what is on the table as is either a budget cut or a budget increase. And thanks to the pandemic spending, that's exactly what we have. Because if you take away this pandemic spending, which was meant to be one time but wasn't, and if you add in the base and make it higher, do you have an increase or a decrease? It's almost like a metaphysical question. So we have to get past that first. And that was the subject, of course, of the big protest last week.
Yeah, but this kind of goes more to the federal thing. I mean, like we relied so much on federal pandemic dollars to fix the budget. But
That's exactly right.
And the governor got killed for it. But he got killed from it by Republicans. But it was a unique way to make sure that the budget was balanced and people were taken care of. But are we now seeing that there's got to be some more creativity or more of a way to attack the budget now that those dollars have drawn up? I guess the better question is there now urgency, guys?
Well, it's a short-term, at least, way to address the problems that have been, not just with UConn, of course, if I can make a pitch, certainly for Connecticut State University system, too, because, they were also face a shortfall and will be per proposed budget. I think the other thing, too, Frankie, and Dan knows this way more than I could ever, is that, it's interesting timing that this came up now in February when things have not been finalized and we had to wait through the spring to see how this goes through the process. This is only the beginning step for what could take place in the General Assembly. So, it's going to be fascinating to see for the next couple of months to see how this flushes out, because is this going to be something where the legislature is going to step into the fray and then find a way to deal with these, budget concerns that are supposed to be short term and extend it? Or are they going to go with Lamont's and their official numbers? I don't know, right? How can anybody have a crystal ball in seeing and sorting out how this will be, for the spring?
We're going to talk more about the columns in a second. I just want to go back to, and Dan reported this. I want to go back into the actual numbers here. It sounds like they've actually stepped up how much money is going to be allotted to UConn, more than they had in 2022 and 23, which is $776 million in state funding in the upcoming two fiscals. But
yeah, that's right. Yeah.
But what we're seeing is that there's actually less of the pandemic dollars. So I just wanted to quantify this. That's why I brought it up. So totally, it looked like it, and this is in Dan's column, $1.08 billion or something like that they got in 22 and 23. And where they're talking about the shortfall is that there's still going to be some pandemic relief dollars, but it's not going to be something like $200 million like it was last time. So that's
right.
Where we get between 194 and 195, Dan.
That's right. There are three sources of money. One is the regular block grant from the general fund. The other is the pandemic. And the third was sharing of the state's surplus. So UConn last year got $750 million in a basic grant, $200 million in ARPA money, and $124 million in shared money. Just, hey, we did great. Here's a little bit of money, just like you give to your kid. right? Feeling rich today, take $10 and go to the movies, right? So this year it's down by $195 million total, but the block grant is up. So what do you call that? Well, it gets really complicated when the governor's office accuses UConn of spending the money on permanent operations when they should have spent it on one-time stuff. And UConn responds by saying, but that's what you told us to do. So because you negotiated a $200 million increase for our professors, that we got to find that money. So that's the dispute. And at the Connecticut State University and college system, state college and university system, it's even more complicated because enrollment is down, which I think Jonathan can talk about.
Yeah, no, it's been a concern for years, as Dan knows, that the numbers just aren't fleshing out, and I certainly stress that in my column too, that we have to find a pathway to go beyond the traditional age students, right? It's no secret, we're just not seeing the numbers, and we won't for a while. I think the prediction is almost a decade from now where we'll see finally an increase in terms of traditional age students. So we have to really consider the older students, and certainly even the military students and other students, especially online options too. That's all on the table.
Hey, just really quickly, what I wanted to say was that in your column, Jonathan, you say that UConn's different from the rest of the universities in the system, or at least from the rest of the from most of the colleges and universities in the system. There's 17 community colleges, something like that.
12, actually, yes.
12,
and
sorry.
The regional state universities would be, yeah. Mm-hmm.
But UConn is so different because, and Mike Anthony got to this, and you linked to it in your column, there's something like a 350% increase in applications to UConn from 1996. That happens to be a year after Gino's team first won with Jen Rosati and Rebecca Lobo, the national championship, and, of course, Ray Allen being on campus for the UConn men, to now. So that's about a 350% increase in applications. They got sports, and that's why they could say something like, hey, maybe we won't play in downtown Hartford anymore. Is that what makes UConn different, or what are your thoughts here?
Well, that, and of course, as you know, Frankie, I also emphasize the political dimensions to their, board of trustees there, because they clearly have some politics involved there, and that's not unusual for, quote unquote flagship state universities. I mean, you see something similarly play out at my alma mater, Rutgers University, where the governor and his staff and administrators get in the weeds of things. Well, no, it's no different in UConn. I mean, I certainly emphasize how the Ritter family has been well known as former and current speaker of our House of Representatives in terms of how they often play a hand in it. And then anybody that the governor puts in there is almost expected. So I think it's interesting that kind of played out beyond, as you're, admitting the recognition of the university and getting the name out there, also how they've gone through so many presidents in the last few years. I couldn't even keep track. I don't know if any alum could keep track at UConn, or even administrator or faculty member, because they went through a flurry of presidents in the last few years with some of the politics that took place with their board.
And we had too much fun here, so I have to wrap up soon, because I love talking about this whole thing, because I thought it was fascinating that UConn came out in the position that it did. Essentially, yes. to spoil Jonathan's column a little bit, I want to make sure people read it, but I think the tenor here is that this could come down to politics, and essentially the lawmakers may hope that UConn, I guess, is forgiven and forgets about it soon. But just really quickly, because I want to bring Lisa in here before I wrap up, I want to just ask Lisa this last question here. When we think about education and higher ed, Lisa, it sounds like higher ed is getting less funding as we go here. Is that correct? Where are we on student loan debt and the conversation, I guess, to get people more money so that they can move on and get into work sooner after college?
Right, exactly what we talked about in the last segment is that federal ARPA money is going away for higher education. That's the fight that's playing out with UConn. But at least when we look at a national picture with higher education, the Biden administration is trying to do student loan debt relief for some federal loans, and depending on income. And so that's just tied up right now because of all the legal challenges. It's actually going to go before the Supreme Court next Tuesday. And so that has been one way, I think, beyond just the federal money for higher education institutions, that we're trying to see some relief go directly towards students. And especially for Pell Grant holders who just happen to be, it's lower income. It especially helps people of color. And so that is kind of where the national focus is right now on higher education. And we'll just see what happens with all these court cases.
I appreciate that, Lisa. And I'm actually going to bring Dan back in here because we got a fan question. A good friend at Con Connection, Kathy Flaherty, asks us on Twitter. She wants to ask you a question, Dan. She's looking at you. Maybe she's thinking about that fire sauce that you put, that Taco Bell fire sauce that you put in your oatmeal today. She has a very serious question, though. She asks, what this measure of equity that you have, how does it apply to people who are unable to work due to disability? How about the enforced poverty we trap people with disabilities into maintain eligibility for programs? You have any thoughts?
Yeah, equity is not just about work. I didn't mean to imply or state that we forget about the people who aren't working. Equity is, I meant to use work as a piece of the analogy. That is, what is your present condition versus what is your condition as compared to the richest of the rich who are here to our benefit. Not necessarily a system we would design. I quickly just want to say that I was at the game last night, and President Renee Kermarick was there, and in very high profile, and a number of legislators were there. And after the close loss, one of the legislators came up to me and said, "That's it. She doesn't get her money." So that sports matters. It was a joke, but it matters.
It certainly does, because that, at the end of the day, especially if they're playing in Hartford, Dan and everybody else on this call, Dan, Jonathan, and Lisa, is the point that after a long day, lawmakers can saunter on over to the XL Center and watch the game. But maybe that'll go away. Who knows? Doesn't sound like it will anytime soon. But thank you so much to Lisa for joining us, the federal policy reporter for the Connecticut Mirror, Dan Haar, Connecticut Hearst Media Associate Editor. He also works for CT Insider, we call it as well. Thank you so much for your time, guys.
Thank you.
So much.
After the break, NPR national correspondent Jennifer Ludden and Connecticut Mirror children's issues and housing reporter Ginny Monk, they're going to join Jonathan for a conversation. We're going to center it around housing and equity. Join the conversation, 888-720-9677. This is Where We Live from Connecticut Public. I'm Frankie Graziano. This hour, we're exploring how Governor Lamont's state budget proposal meets a new law, calling for an explanation of how spending would reduce socioeconomic and racial inequality where we live. And if you were listening to that earlier segment we had Dan Haar from CT Insider, who tells us that the way it manifested in this budget was it was an 8-page document explaining how inequity was addressed at the top of the budget. One of the biggest issues defining and driving those inequalities is housing, and some $600 million earmarked for this in Governor Lamont's proposal. Here to discuss this on the state level is Ginny Monk, Connecticut Mirror's children's issues and housing reporter. Good morning, Ginny.
Good morning.
Thank you so much for coming on. And Jennifer Ludden, NPR national correspondent covering economic inequality with a focus on housing disparities and food insecurity. And per her NPR bio, I really appreciate this, that you seek to explain the growing gap between socioeconomic groups and government policies to try and change it. Thank you so much for the work that you do, Jennifer.
Thank you, and good morning.
Good morning. And, of course, we're still joined by Jonathan Wharton. I still hope you're with us, Jonathan.
I am still here.
The conversation on campus didn't take you away. I appreciate that. And you can join the conversation if you're listening to us. 888-720-9677. 888-720-9677. Ginny, $600 million for affordable housing. Can you help break this down?
Sure. So there's a few different funds it's going to. There's $100 million, and this is all spent over 2 years. So $100 million would be $50 million each year for the state's Time to Own program, which is a down payment assistance program for low and moderate income households. There's $200 million to expand workforce development housing, $100 million for the Housing Trust Fund, and notably, this portion includes multi-unit housing in downtowns close to transportation hubs, which has been a zoning reform push this session, and another 200 million for flexible housing needs.
It's good to hear about the housing trust fund there, but the big concern that everybody has with this with affordable housing, I guess anywhere you look, is going to be with zoning. And the budget address that the Governor Lamont delivered, he talked about encouraging local municipalities to do more on zoning and the regulations that they have. So I guess this is where I kind of want to pivot to Jennifer before we talk about this new budget law. Do you see a lot of this kind of lip service nationally, or like are state lawmakers, state officials kind of tied back to their hands to what municipalities and counties can really do on zoning?
So there's more than lip service. There's a lot happening, and it is very contentious. Just to step back for a minute, I mean, zoning laws in this country, they have a whole history of inequality, right? They go back to redlining generations ago. In many, if not most, American cities, a good 3/4 of the residential land is specifically zoned for single families only. That happened after housing discrimination based on race was outlawed. So the city said, well, okay, you can only have a single family home. And de facto, that kept out a lot of homeowners of color and lower income homeowners. And we do see a lot of debates happening now that we have this incredible housing crunch, and everyone is feeling the impact of a lack of housing, and rates have just, shot up. Prices have shot up so high, both for rentals and home owning. We've had 3 states in the past few years, California, Oregon, and Maine, have actually ended single family only mandates statewide. And a number of cities have done it, and a lot of cities are debating it. And it's tough. People, living on a beautiful tree-lined suburban street don't want change to their neighborhood. And yet, if you look, there's incredible disconnect with as houses have kind of gotten bigger and bigger. I mean, I'm sure you're seeing it in Connecticut, kind of the economics of construction demand that everything get bigger to kind of justify the home builder's expense. Our households have shrunk in this country. Today, almost 2/3 of them are only 1 or 2 people. You've got a lot of aging seniors and a lot of millennials. And so there's a real disconnect and a real struggle to say, okay, how can we open up this land with this zoning regulations to allow in some more multifamily units? And
from reporting here locally, I've seen that it's 1 or 2 people living on average in Connecticut, a $380,000 home. I want to just bring in Jonathan and Ginny real quick on the housing on the zoning front. I want to be fair to the state and try to get this and try to talk about this more thoroughly. Ginny, do you think the governor's doing all he can here on zoning and trying to get towns like Westport and I guess Woodbridge to try to hold up their end of the bargain? What do you think?
So it's an interesting question, because the governor with this budget is essentially saying he supports encouraging through some financial incentives, changes to zoning law. That's sort of what we saw with the Housing Trust Fund, particularly for increasing residential density in downtowns near transportation hubs. But there's also been a real push in the state to tell municipalities, we're not going to encourage you, we're going to tell you have to change the zoning. So whether he's doing all he can, I think this is significant within the confines of encouraging through financial incentives, but he's not making municipalities do anything.
We spoke with Erin Boggs. She's the executive director for the Open Communities Alliance about the budget's housing priorities. She said the budget addresses the housing crisis in terms of affordability and segregation, but said she has concerns about the scope of affordable housing in making long-term and systemic changes. We'll play that clip for you.
In particular, though, I think it's important to look at the extent to which any of these proposals are designed to create housing that will be deed restricted as affordable for decades to come. And typically, and that's going to be a lot of this housing, and typically that is going to be more likely to be in denser configurations. And so if you're not allowed to have denser housing in most of the state, then we're going to end up with segregation. We're going to be reinforcing our lines of segregation. Considering the growing consensus around the need for affordable housing, if we want the kind of sustained economic development that Governor Lamont talks about, we can't be satisfied with the status quo when it comes to zoning.
I think this gets into a larger battle that Jennifer's covered here. I just want to really get to the thorny issue of affordable housing. One recent headline: the U.S. needs more affordable housing. Where to put it is a bigger battle.
Yes, and people don't want it next to them generally. I mean, that hasn't really changed. Although I will say that has been the case for many, many years. You actually also have this counter push. They call themselves the YIMBYs, the Yes in My Backyard. They really are pushing their local officials to bring in more housing. So there's quite a debate happening. Now, the question is that, as your speaker there alluded to, is it going to be affordable? So when we, the Turner Center at UC Berkeley looked at what's happening so far in places that have opened up their zoning, and there's for many, many different reasons, there's not, it's been really slow to take off so far for a lot of technical design and land use things that they may or may not have done. But one question is, most of this, it's market rate, right? So like in Portland, Oregon, you can build up to 4 units. You can build a little more. You can build up to 6 units if you make sure that 3 of them are deemed for affordable housing with subsidies. But largely it's market rate. And so even a market, duplex or triplex, it's pretty pricey, and it's not going to be cheap enough for some of, workers who talk about workforce housing, people who live, work, and teachers and firefighters and government workers. They still may not be able to afford this. And supporters will say, well, look, we're thinking long term. This duplex or triplex, in 30 years, it's going to be older and it'll be more affordable. So it's a real there's short-term urgent needs, plus this long-term outlook, and it's not an easy fix.
Jonathan, we've talked here about where to put affordable housing. We've also talked about the state's plans to address affordable housing. What are your thoughts?
Well, Hugh Bailey put together a great editorial. He's actually my editor over at Connecticut Post, and it came out about a week and a half ago. And he actually came out against, or was really concerned, kind of both ways, about the governor's pitch towards this, that more money and more pathways could have been dealt with to address the issues around affordable housing. In truth, especially in Connecticut, as everybody's mentioning, and I want to add to this, there is a dimension and a negative stigma associated with affordable housing, because the assumption is that affordable housing is just for, the poor people or less desirable, whatever you want to label, so many people who are low income. But in fact, it's really more for the workforce housing, it's, as you all are speaking towards, and certainly those in the public sector. Unfortunately, that gets lost in all of this. I will say that in some instances, in some places, and we need to remember this, especially in Connecticut, it compares differently. Like if you look at Maryland and New Jersey, they base a lot of this surrounding county government. We don't have county government here per se, as it relates to an issue like this. So this goes back to the local concerns surrounding zoning, and it's going to be very difficult to kind of carve out niches or places to do this. I will give credit to places like New Haven, for example, where I was on the City Plan Commission, where at least
I got to jump in here. You got about 10 seconds or less because we got to wrap up. Go ahead.
Transit-oriented development to do a lot of these kind of initiatives. So I think that's a good beginning point that the state can do.
Thank you, Jonathan. And I just want to turn people towards Ginny's reporting, because she just covered this CAP hearing that they had, or this housing hearing at the Capitol. So go to ctmirror.org to learn more, because it's important, as they're talking about a potential fair rent cap that may be about 4% plus inflation. Thank you so much for listening to Where We Live today. Thank you to Kat Pastor and Katie Pellico for producing today's show. You're listening to Where We Live. Take care. Have a nice day.